You can tell when someone is trapped in the wrong model of manifestation by one sentence. Nothing is happening, so nothing is changing. I used to think that too, but the longer I looked at this strange quiet phase people call the in-between, the more I realized something unsettling. The most destabilizing part of change is not always collapse. It is the silence that comes after the old identity stops feeling true, but before the new one feels real enough to trust. That is the phase people mistake for delay, when in many cases, it is transition. Psychology has language for part of this. The Zeigarnik effect points to something important. Unfinished states do not leave the mind easily. What is not resolved keeps pulling on attention. It stays open, active, unsettling, and that matters here, because the in-between phase of manifestation is usually described in mystical language, as if the universe just went quiet. But there is a more grounded explanation. The brain does not handle unresolved transitions well. An unfinished desire creates tension, but an unfinished self, that creates even more, and that is what makes this phase so confusing. From the outside, almost nothing may look different. You may still live in the same place, wake up to the same ceiling, check the same messages, open the same apps, talk to the same people, but internally something has already become incompatible. The old assumptions do not fit the same way. The old emotional logic stops landing. The old self-image begins to lose authority, and yet the new one has not gathered enough evidence to feel normal. So you end up in a strange psychological territory. Not fully who you were, not yet stable in who you are becoming. That is why this phase can feel blank, suspended, heavy. Not because nothing is happening, but because you are no longer fully organized by the identity that came before. And that is the first illusion to break. Stillness is not the same thing as failure. Failure usually has shape. It gives you a story, a rejection, a number, a goodbye, a clear ending. Stillness gives you none of that. It offers no closure, no clean explanation, no obvious proof. It leaves you in an interpretive vacuum, and the human mind fills vacuums badly. Think of an airport gate when the departure board says delayed. You're no longer where you started, but you're not where you thought you were going either. You're suspended between departure and arrival. That is what identity transition feels like. Not movement you can celebrate, not collapse you can explain, just a middle space where motion becomes invisible. And this is where a second framework becomes useful. Predictive processing. In simple terms, the brain is not just waiting for reality and then reacting. It is constantly predicting what should happen next. It builds expectations, compares them with what actually happens, then updates itself through mismatch. So the mind is always asking, what should be happening right now? And why doesn't reality match it yet? Now apply that to manifestation. If someone has begun changing internally, their expectations often shift before their evidence does. They may think differently, notice different opportunities, feel less attached to old limitations, become less loyal to the life they used to tolerate. But the outer world may not confirm any of it yet. So now the brain enters conflict. The old model says, nothing special happens for me. The emerging model says that is no longer true. And reality for a while says almost nothing at all, and that gap is brutal. Because the brain does not experience silence as neutral. Silence becomes tension. The old identity no longer explains your inner world cleanly. The new identity cannot yet explain your outer world cleanly. So attention becomes restless. You start checking, interpreting, replaying, scanning for signs, overreading delays, treating uncertainty like a verdict. I noticed this in my own thinking long before I had language for it. The quiet phase felt personal, almost insulting, as if reality was withholding feedback on purpose. But once I started seeing this through the lens of identity transition and predictive processing, the texture of that silence changed. It no longer felt empty, it felt unresolved, and that difference matters. Because people make a serious mistake here. They assume discomfort means misalignment. But sometimes discomfort increases because the old identity is breaking down faster than the new one can stabilize. That is a very different thing. Identity-based motivation research helps explain why. Difficulty does not always mean stop. Sometimes difficulty feels meaningful if it fits the person you believe you are becoming, and sometimes the exact same difficulty feels defeating if it clashes with your self-concept. So two people can face the same delay and live inside completely different realities. One person sees silence and thinks, "Nothing is moving. I was wrong." Another sees silence and thinks, "The old model is losing power. The new one just isn't automatic yet." Same delay, same ambiguity, different identity filter. That is why manifestation cannot be understood only as outcome. It also has to be understood as perception. A good analogy is posture correction. If someone has walked in misalignment for years, standing properly can feel unnatural at first. Weak, unstable, even wrong. Not because it is wrong, but because distortion had become familiar. Identity change works the same way. The more accurate position can feel less believable than the old one, simply because the old one had time on its side. Now here is the cynical question underneath all of this. Isn't this just a sophisticated excuse people use when results are not showing up? Sometimes yes, and that distinction matters. If nothing is changing in your attention, behavior, interpretation, or emotional patterning, then "I'm in transition" can become a beautiful lie, a spiritualized version of avoidance. If you are still making the same choices, protecting the same fears, rehearsing the same identity, and calling that transformation, then the silence is not sacred, it is repetition. But if your old reactions are weakening, if different possibilities are becoming visible, if your emotional loyalty to the old story is cracking, then the stillness may be functional. It may be the gap between internal reorganization and visible proof. That is why the in-between is so easy to misread. It looks passive from the outside, but internally it can be one of the most demanding phases of change. Take career transition as an example. Research on identity transition shows that people often try on provisional selves before a new identity fully stabilizes. They experiment, they test new roles, new habits, new social worlds, new stories about who they are, and for a while, none of them fit perfectly. So they exist in a strange threshold. Not who they were, not yet fully who they are becoming. That is not fluff. That is a known pattern. So what does your in-between actually mean? It means the old evidence no longer defines you with the same force. It means the new evidence is not yet dense enough to feel normal. It means your nervous system is still asking for closure. It means uncertainty feels louder because the brain prefers a painful certainty over an unfinished reorganization. And this is exactly where most manifestation content becomes shallow. It tells people to just trust. But trust without mechanism is fragile. A better explanation is this. Stillness often appears when identity, expectation, and external evidence are moving at different speeds. And if you do not understand that, you will mistake transition for failure. Here is the part that changes the meaning of the entire video. The stillness before manifestation does not always happen because nothing is arriving. It often happens because your brain cannot yet treat the arriving version of you as normal. That is the twist. People assume visible movement creates identity change, but often identity change begins first, and reality is still being filtered through a system that is not fully updated. So the quiet phase is not always the absence of movement. Sometimes it is the lag between internal model revision and external recognition. That is why this phase can feel more intense after you begin changing, not before. If the old identity is still intact, there is no conflict. You simply live inside it. Conflict begins the moment the old map stops making sense, and the new one is not yet automatic enough to trust. Think of a software update running in the background. The screen looks still, but underneath files are being replaced, processes are being rewritten, dependencies are shifting. Open the wrong thing too early and the whole system feels unstable. But instability does not prove the update failed. It proves two systems are overlapping. And that overlap is exactly what many people call delay. This also helps explain why external proof often appears late. It is not only that the world changes slowly, it is that perception, interpretation, and action have to become consistent enough for the new pattern to register. Identity is not a statement. It is a filter, and filters change what you notice, what you believe, what you approach, what you dismiss, what you are finally willing to act on. Two people can receive the same opportunity, the same message, the same uncertain opening. One misses it because it does not match the old self concept. The other moves toward it because the identity filter has shifted. From the outside, that can look like luck, but underneath it often looks like perception becoming compatible with a new reality. So the real fear underneath this topic is not, what if my manifestation is delayed? The deeper fear is, what if I have already outgrown the old self, but I still do not know how to live as the new one? That fear is real, because transition removes the comfort of a finished identity. The old structure loosens, the new structure is incomplete, and in the middle you do not always know how to name what is happening to you. That is why the middle feels so lonely. You cannot measure it the way you measure a result. You cannot always explain it to people who have never felt it. Sometimes all you know is this: the old version of you no longer feels believable, and the new version of you still needs more proof before it feels natural. But that does not make the stillness meaningless. It may mean you are no longer being organized by the identity that created the old reality, and what you are calling delay may actually be the period where a new organizing principle is still becoming believable enough to live from. So here is the cleanest distinction. Delay is when nothing relevant is reorganizing. Transition is when reorganization is happening before it becomes obvious. Those are not the same thing. So if stillness has entered your life, do not ask only, why is nothing happening? Ask something better. What model is losing authority? And what model is not yet strong enough to feel effortless? Because some silences are dead ends, but some are thresholds. And the difference is whether identity, attention, and interpretation are actually changing underneath them. Some phases look empty only because the self that is ending cannot yet understand what the next self is building.